All right, we're on page 72. Next is the myth that murderers are ordinary gun owners. The case for reducing firearms availability to ordinary people rests on two interrelated myths endorsed explicitly and implicitly by the health advocacy literature on firearms. These myths are, first, that most murderers would be considered law-abiding citizens prior to their pulling the trigger, and that most shootings are not committed by felons or mentally ill people, but are acts of passion that are committed using a handgun that is owned for protection. From these myths, others follow that firearms availability to ordinary citizen is the primary cause of murder, that murder would radically decrease if ordinary citizens were deprived of those guns, and that it is unnecessary to worry much about the enforcement of gun bans because even if criminals would not disarm, the law-abiding will, and they themselves are committing most murders. It simply isn't true that previously law-abiding citizens commit most murders, or that many murders or virtually any murders, and so disarming them could not eliminate most or many or virtually any murders. Homicide studies show that murderers are not ordinary citizens, but extreme appearance, of whom it is unrealistic to assume they will have more compunction about flouting gun laws than about murder. The great majority of murderers have life histories of violence, felony records, substance abuse, and car and other dangerous accidents. The anti-gun health advocacy literature avoids the problems of abhorrence of murderers raise for their view, just stating facts that are false. A truly startling example, because it contradicts its own writings, is that of CDC's Dr. Mark Rosenberg, who avows his desire to create a public perception of firearms as dirty, deadly, and banned. To mislead readers into blaming firearms for crime rather than criminals, Dr. Rosenberg actually goes so far as to claim that, this is a quote, most of the perpetrators of violence are not criminals by trade or profession. Indeed, in the area of domestic violence, most of the perpetrators are never accused of any crime. The victims and perpetrators are ourselves, ordinary citizens, students, professionals, and even public health workers. Okay, so they added a note here that was confusing. So it starts out again. Most of the perpetrators of violence and then it says as a subnote, can he really mean not just murders, but robbers and rapists as well? That's very confusing to read that in the middle of it all. Anyway, it goes on. The falsity of this is apparent from other statements in the same article and in other articles by Dr. Rosenberg. Violence is foreign to the lives of most public health professionals, and in others, most family homicides involve spouses and occur after a series of prior assaultive incidents. The next section, gun ownership as a high-risk factor for homicide in the home. In this is the title of a 1993 New England Journal of Medicine article whose authors include several of Sloan's co-authors on the Vancouver-Seattle two-city comparison discussed above. Since space limitations constrain us to a brief summary of the vast majority of health advocacy articles, we have selected this article for a detailed critique. One reason is that this article, hereafter called the NEJM 1993, was widely publicized in the media and has been voluminously cited in the health advocacy literature. Moreover, this article continues a long series of prior widely publicized health advocacy studies. Regrettably, it and the prior studies would be more appropriately cited in a statistics textbook as a cautionary example of multiple statistical errors. Before addressing these, however, it is necessary to set out some basic statistical analysis. Statistical analysis are used to reach conclusions in the face of certain types of uncertainty. Uncertainty results from such factors as inherent variation in the subjects being studied, the effects of many other influencers, both known and unknown, and limited resources which restrict the amount of data that can be collected in studies. Statistical analysis may result in erroneous conclusions for a variety of reasons, some acceptable, others not. We shall ignore in this discussion errors in recording data and of calculation because, although unacceptable, they have become less common with the use of computers and statistical analysis programs. But many other types of errors can occur that are of grave concern when the conclusions will be used to make decisions on how to act. In the medical area, such decisions may affect the choice of medical treatment or may affect policy decisions in the public sector. In either case, the use of flawed conclusions may lead to literally fatal consequences. Next section, what you see isn't necessarily what you get. We can safely assume that statistical analysis program on the computer does the calculations of the statistical analysis correctly. This isn't always true. Moreover, data entry errors are sufficiently common to require careful checking by the analyst to catch them. But at least neither calculation errors nor data entry errors that slip through will be consistently biased in favor of any particular agenda the analyst may have. More serious concerns involve errors of the analyst which can be related to a conscious or an unconscious agenda. The analyst is responsible for choosing the correct type of analysis, for making sure the assumptions required for the use of a type of statistical analysis are met, and that the results are described correctly. When there are errors in any of these areas, the conclusions reached can be particularly or completely wrong, even in the absence of any other errors. The presence of these errors in a study does not guarantee that the conclusions are invalid, but the conclusions then are unsubstantiated, and the scientific impartiality of the analyst is called into question. Errors are of a particular concern when they are made in such a way as to facilitate conclusions which confirm the previous stance of the analyst. It is seldom possible to connect a scientific study for which only the effects to be tested are operating. The statistical field of experimental design is concerned with methods which allow the detection of the effects to be studied even when other factors are operating. Failure to separate the effects to be studied from extraneous effects leads to a confusion between them and the unintended confounding of extraneous effects with the effects to be studied. The resulting conclusions are not based on tests of the effects being studied. Rather, they reflect some unknown combination of these effects and the extraneous effects combined with them. Thus, the hypotheses strongly or supposedly being studied are not in effect being studied, and what you see is not what you get. Next section, purpose and design of NEJM 1993. The hypothesis NEJM 1993 was supposedly studying whether keeping a firearm in the home confers protection against crime or instead increases the risk of violent crime in the home. Very simplistically described, the study compares a sample of households in which homicide occurred to a supposedly similar sample in which they did not. It finds that the homicide households were more likely to have contained guns. From this, it concludes that guns were more of a danger than a protection. The study used data from 3 urban counties: Shelby County, Tennessee, containing Memphis, King County, Washington, King County, Washington, containing Seattle, and Sumter County, Ohio, containing Cleveland. The data consisted in all cases of homicide in the home during the chosen periods. To compare with these homicide cases, a control was selected for each homicide victim. These control subjects were matched to the homicide victim with respect to sex, age range, race, and neighborhood of residence. Various kinds of information were then obtained by reading police or official reports as to homicide cases, by interviewing other occupants of the homicide case households, and by interviewing either the control subject or another equivalent of his or her household. No observable pattern in international homicide and suicide. As discussed below, the shibboleth is also refuted by a decline in domestic American homicide correlating to the vast increase in gun ownership during the 1970s and 1980s. To mask this embarrassing downward trend in murder, the health sages begin in the mid-1980s, massaging the statistics by combining homicide and suicide into one joint figure. This produced an international homicide rate, which once again they claimed was to have been caused by widespread gun ownership. But this combined homicide-suicide approach embarrasses the health advisory shibboleth in another way, which requires avoidance through yet another statistical manipulation. Anti-gun advocates like to compare American homicide rates to those of low-violence European nation as proof that strict European gun laws reduce homicide. Of course, when we remember that low European violence rates long preceded strict gun controls, what the comparison proves is that countries that differ in culture and institutional and socioeconomic arrangements are likely to have different violence rates. By the same token, though the U.S. suicide rate actually exceeds its homicide rate, European suicide rates are still much higher. These much higher suicide rates further confirm that decisive factors in societal harms associated with guns are culture and other issues more fundamental than availability of some particular kind of weaponry. So anti-gun advocates offer international homicide rate comparisons, but never international suicide rate comparisons, even though they also emphasize American suicide rates, which they attribute to widespread gun ownership. Thus, for instance, when the CDC discusses homicide alone, international comparisons are made, but whenever the CDC combines homicide and suicide data, is only given for the United States. The example of health sage Susan Baker is especially apt. She originated the idea of combining suicide and homicide in discussing American statistics, thereby inflating the gun death total and concealing the fact that American homicide was declining as handgun ownership increased. If deception is not the object, why, when she uses cross-national comparison to support an anti-gun syllabus, does she abandon her own supposedly preferable combined suicide and homicide creation and revert to the homicide-only approach? In arguing that restrictive gun laws reduce homicide, she points out that Denmark's murder rate is about 7 deaths per 100,000 population, lower than the United States. If she had compared suicide rates, however, she would have had to admit the Danish rate is much higher. But by the same token, when she compared the two nations' combined homicide and suicide rates, according to her own supposedly preferred method, she would have to admit the Danish combined rate was almost 50% higher than the American. Curious about what would happen if Professor Baker's combined homicide-suicide rate was used in making international comparisons, we constructed a table. I'm going to go over to that table right now, since that table is just here on page 61. So table 2 has 5 columns, a whole bunch of rows. The first column is the country. Next is, the suicide rate, the murder rate, the combined rate, and then the year. And I guess they're in order of their combined. And the highest combined is Estonia, followed by Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Ukraine, Denmark, Austria, Switzerland, France, Belgium. United States comes in there at this point, followed by Sweden, Germany, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Canada, and Israel. Suicide rates are also in order. So the largest suicide rate is in Estonia. The smallest is in Israel. The murder rates also are in order for the most part, except for a couple of exceptions, including the United States, which has a larger murder rate than most of the countries around it. But our suicide rate keeps our overall combined much lower. And our numbers were from 95. Most of the other countries were from 91 or 90. And it probably has to do with the amount of money they spend keeping track of those kind of numbers. All right, so we're going to go back to the reading. How well do the results in Table 2 comport to the health advocacy syllabus that more access to guns means homicide and suicide, more homicide and suicide, while strict guns laws reduce each? Of the nations for which figures were available, the United States ranks below the median when suicide and homicide rates are combined. The U.S. combined rate is less than half the combined rate of the gun-banning Russia. Such firearm-intensive countries like Australia and New Zealand rank very low on the table, and the lowest rate is for Israel, a country which actually encourages and requires most universal gun possession. In short, Professor Baker's combined suicide-homicide approach does not serve as the health advocate's political agenda if applied in comparing the United States to gun-banning countries that health advocates cite as models of American policy. So it is only when they discuss U.S. figures that Professor Baker and the other health sages combined murder and suicide figures. Reviewing the entire health advocacy literature on guns and suicide, we have been unable to find even one reference to the much greater suicide rates in gun-banning European countries or the much lower suicide rate in Israel. The anti-gun literature never discusses the syllabus in connection with the suicide rates of gun-banning foreign countries. The one exception is Sloan, who followed the Vancouver-Seattle homicide comparison with an unintentionally hilarious comparison of the suicide rates in the two cities. Unfazed by the fact that the Canadian city had the higher suicide rate, Sloan emphasized that it had a lower suicide rate for one subgroup, adolescents and young men. Thus, they solemnly intone it is due to the United States having lax gun laws and more gun availability. And what is the cause of Canadians having higher suicide rates overall? Do not venture to speculate. They do not venture to speculate on that. That brings us to the issue of health advocacy articles stressed during the 1980s, suicide of young males, a poignant phenomenon that supposedly was increasing in response to the ever-increasing number of firearms in the United States. Naturally, the health advocates' articles drawing this connection never mention that suicide among teenage and young adults, has been increasing dramatically throughout the entire industrialized world. By the same token, readers of health advocacy articles blaming American suicide rates on guns would never learn that while suicide among American males aged 15 to 24 increased 7% during the period 1980 to 90, the increase in suicide among English males of this age was over 10 times greater, 78%. Car exhaust poisoning being the method of suicide used most often. Despite recent increases in youth suicide, the population subgroup most likely to shoot themselves are elderly men. We take leave to doubt that any healthcare advocate or anyone else is wise enough to decide a 76-year-old man in failing health whether or not he should live or die. But such philosophical considerations are never mentioned by health sages, asserting that more guns means more suicide, Sibylla. Modesty about their own wisdom is not likely to find favor with sages who are confident enough to be willing to promote their policy prescription for American society by cloaking sagecraft in its pseudo-scholarly literature. Setting aside the philosophical issue, it is pragmatically arguable that if guns are unavailable, people who are seriously enough interested in killing themselves to use a gun will find some other way. On the other hand, some suicide may occur impulsively because the immediate availability of a deadly mechanism to a person who might have not completed the act had the time for reflection been required. The intellectual desert inhabited by health advocates is epitomized by the failure inability to cite the strongest empirical showing for gun control by means of reducing suicide. They do not know this study because it has been done by Gary Kleck, whose work they compulsively avoid. Suicide is a serious issue. It deserves serious scholarly discussion, rather than being used as a political football by unscrupulous propagandists grasping at any opportunity to make a case for their preordained agenda. Finally, consider the implications of Table 2 for the health advocacy syllabus that strict gun laws equal low homicide. The observable pattern that would exist if such were true simply does not exist. Denmark, whose strict anti-gun laws Professor Baker praises, has almost 4 times more homicide than Switzerland and more than 4 times more homicide than Israel. Switzerland's very gun-restrictive neighbor Germany has about 25% more homicide than Switzerland and 50% more than Israel. Germany's very gun-restrictive neighbor Belgium has more than 20% more homicide than Germany, and their mutual neighbor Luxembourg, where gun ownership is completely illegal, has more than 100% more. England, with its much ballyhooed anti-gun policies, has the lowest homicide rate of all, but homicide with exactly the same laws has almost 3 times as much homicide as England and much more than Israel or Switzerland. These statistics are not intended to, nor do they prove, that strict gun laws cause homicide. What they do reinforce is the conclusion set out above in the section titled The Verdict of Criminology Scholarship. Gun ownership is responsible, or by responsible adults, is not the cause of special problems associated with guns. What causes these problems is gun possession by irresponsible people. Disarming criminals and irresponsible people is a highly desirable goal, but it is not reasonable to anticipate any more success than the law has in preventing or deterring them from violent acts. In every society, the number of guns suffices to arm those who desire to misuse them. The next section is gun availability, social harms, and fraudulent non-disclosure. Having dealt with the international statistics, we move now to domestic American statistics. Here again, to sustain the health advocacy syllabus, sages routinely suppress facts and truncate, select, or even falsify statistics and data. They must doctor the statistics because a full and accurate rendition would not show the easily observable, consistent, and coherent pattern of more guns equals more murder, suicide, and accidents. At this point, we need to offer a caveat as the health advocacy literature's suppression of data and or relationships. When we say something is never mentioned or discussed in that literature, we are not denying that independently knowledgeable readers might be able to ferret parts out of it. For instance, we can find tucked in a table the fact that young inner-city black males have a homicide rate almost 1,000% greater than their counterparts in rural areas. But a correlative fact will not be found, much less discussed, because it casts doubt on the syllabus. The correlative fact that rural blacks have far lower murder rate, despite having a rate of gun ownership and or availability comparable to whites, i.e. a rate far exceeding that of black urban blacks. A fortiori, there is no discussion of how these correlated facts can be squared with the more guns equals more murder syllabus. Suppression of declining accidental gun fatalities. We use terms like suppression and non-disclosure advisedly to describe a pattern of fact omission which renders the statements made deceptive or likely to mislead. Suppression thus differs in method, though not in effect, from affirmative misrepresentation, overt mendacy, which we separately catalog in anti-gun health advocacy writings. We earlier detailed suppression by health advocates of the fact that 2/3 decline in fatal gun accidents over a 20-year period from 1967 to 86 coincided with a 173% increase in handgun stock. This correlation goes so remarkably unremarked upon because it triply embarrasses the health advocate sages' political agenda. First, to acknowledge it would be undercutting their use of danger of gun accident as a reason for opposing gun ownership. Second, such acknowledgement might lead the readers to well-justified skepticism about the syllabus that increasing gun availability increases the rates of murder, suicide, and fatal accidents. Third, admitting the remarkable decline in fatal gun accidents might prompt inquiry about linkage to correlative phenomenon that occurred during the same years. The handgun's replacement of the long gun as a weapon kept loaded for defense by Americans' homes and stores. Handgun prohibition advocates themselves argue that banning handguns would reverse that trend, causing a return to long guns for home and office defense, weapons that advocates, in their abysmal ignorance of firearms, erroneously think are safer than handguns. In fact, the necessary effect of such a reversal would be to increase accidental fatalities. If kept loaded and ready for rapid defense deployment, long guns are both more likely to be accidentally discharged and much more deadly when discharged than are handguns. Moreover, a long gun is much more difficult to secure from children. The comparative dangers are more clear by comparison of the available figures breaking down gun involvement in fatal gun accidents. Though 90% or more of the firearms kept loaded at any time are handguns, handguns are involved in less than 14% of the accidental gun fatalities. It is estimated that 85% of loaded handguns in American homes, that the 85.2% of loaded handguns in American homes in the year 1980 had been long guns instead. The number of fatal gun accidents would have more than quadrupled, from 1,244 to about 5,000, i.e. about 4,000 lives per year would have been lost by accidental shootings in the home. Table 3 provides all available comparative data on involvement of handguns, rifles, and shotguns in accidental death. It's another table. I'm not going to go through it. It's titled Table 3 National Safety Council Gun Accident Statistics. And it just talks about the number of gun accidents between 1991 and 1979. And it looks like there was a total of 21,000. And most of them were unspecified by a great number. 14,000 of the 21,000 were unspecified as to whether they were handgun, rifle, or shotgun. To help promote, so the next section is suppression of decline in accidental child gun death. To help promote their gun control agenda, health advocate sages have long harped on the emotionally charged issue of child death by gun accident. Naturally, sages cannot acknowledge the steep decline in such tragedies. Acknowledging that would, in itself, undercut their political agenda. Worse, it would hoist political sages on their own emotional petard. What if someone were inspired to ask whether their proposed handgun bans might reverse the decline and may cause hundreds more children to die in gun accidents involving long guns. Finally, by suppressing any mention of the decline, health advocate sages leave themselves free to continue fabricating statistics to exaggerate the number of child deaths. Statistics which, but for their tragic subject matter, would be comic in their wild inconsistency. Using the exaggerated figures, health advocate sages to capitalize on the emotionalism of childhood fatalities, thereby evading legitimate questions about their nostrum of banning and confiscating handguns, or all guns, as a mean of reducing such tragedies, we offer the following questions, which, of course, are never discussed in the health advocacy literature on child and guns. First, if so sweeping a measure of confiscating 230 million firearms is justified because some 273 children under the age 15 die in firearms accidents annually, is the less intrusive measure of banning child bicycles justified by the death of 3 times as many children in bicycle accidents annually? If confiscating 80 or more million handguns is justified because approximately 15 children under age 5 die in handgun accidents annually, is a ban of cigarette lighters justified by the fact that 4 times as many such children die from playing with them annually? Consider these facts. More than 400% more children under age 15 die in drownings than in gun accidents, and 20 times as many children under age 5 drown in bathtubs and home swimming pools as are killed by handgun accidents. Few people need a bathtub as opposed to a shower or stall or a swimming pool. If the tragedy of accidental childhood gun facilities justifies confiscating 80 million or more handguns or 230 million or more firearms, do the much greater numbers of tragic childhood drownings justify a licensing system under which only the disabled and others who show they truly need a bath or swimming pool will be allowed to have them? Note, we do not pose these rhetorical questions having only one clear right answer. Reasonable people may well differ vehemently over how they ought to be answered. That is precisely why scholars discussing the role of firearms and other potentially harmful media in society ought to disclose the facts and raise the questions. Regrettably, the possibility that honestly informing people might lead to differing conclusions is also the reason the facts and questions are never raised by health sages who capitalize on the issue of accidental child deaths to argue for banning handguns or all guns. The next section is suppression of gun homicide comparison data. There's a note. Based on figures available when it was written, this section shows how the syllabus is belied by the fact the massive long-term increases in the American gun stock have been accompanied by declining homicide rates. Later figures are available in the 2000 article by Don Cates and Daniel Polsby, cited at note 74. The following summaries these figures. Implicit in the syllabus is the major increases in availability of guns or handguns will be accompanied by regular, indeed roughly corresponding increases in the rates of homicide over that same period. But there has been no such coincidence in these data. That must a minimum be regarded as an anomaly, and if not an outright refute of the hypothesis that gun availability is a main, if not the primary cause of American homicide rates. Post-World War... Is this still the note? I think this is still the note. Post-World War II American homicide rates peaked in 1979 and actually decreased over 15 years from 80 to 94. In this period, the number of handguns in civilian hands increased from 51 million to 84 million, or about 64%, while gun ownership overall increased 40% from 667 million to 235 million weapons. In this time period, there was no increase at all, much less a corresponding increase in homicide rates. In fact, the rate declined from 10% per 100,000 in 1980 to 9% per 100,000 in 1994. This was no anomaly. If one pushes out the study period to 25 years, the period from 1973 to 97, the lack of correlation between homicide rates and firearms availability appears even more stark. Over that period, homicide decreased from 27%, despite an approximate 160% increase in the number of handguns owned by civilians, from 39 million to 94.9 million, and a 103% increase in civilian gun ownership, from 128 million to 254 million. The consistent characteristic pattern of the entire post-war period has been that murder rates and firearms acquisition patterns have been uncorrelated, with only the relatively brief period from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s as an exception. The increases in firearms over this period, moreover, have far outstripped population increases. In 1973, there were 610 guns, that's 175 handguns per thousand population. By 94, the figures were 905 guns and 325 handguns per thousand population, respectively. Of course, within the 1973 to 97 period, homicide rates fluctuated considerably, rising in some years, falling in others. In themselves, these fluctuations provide further evidence that homicide rates are independent of gun availability levels. Guns, particularly handguns, availability levels exhibit no comparable fluctuation. While homicide rates rise and fell, handgun ownership only rose. Each year from 1973 to 97, the existing stock increased between 1 to 3 million new handguns. These increases were accompanied by long-term decline in murder, not the increase that would have occurred and that has insistently been predicted by believers in the syllabus. All that was the note. Once again, these are facts that readers whose information comes from health advocacy literature will never learn. Syllabus diverts attention from actual causes. Likewise, never discussed, at least in connection with breakdowns of rates of firearms ownership by race, in the health advocacy literature, is that the white homicide rate has steadily fallen since 1980. The apparent increase in homicide rate from the mid-1980s on is due entirely to that steady fall in the homicide being offset by a vast increase in homicide in drug and crime-ridden, poverty-stricken inner cities. Inner city and minority youth homicide is a regular theme in anti-gun health literature. Of course, health sages never note that the whites whose murder rate is declining are far more likely to own guns per capita than African Americans in general, and that black gun ownership is lowest in the inner cities. Mentioning that would at once just confirm their syllabus that gun availability causes homicide and support the leading English criminological analyst pessimistic view that in any society the number of guns always suffices to arm the few who want to obtain and use them illegally. In that connection, remember the fact that young black inner-city males have a homicide rate of about 900% greater than their counterparts in rural areas, even though those low homicide rural blacks have far greater gun ownership than do urban blacks. In sum, increased firearm availability to honest, responsible people of any race does not cause increased violence. Neither is low availability to such people associated with lower violence. Taken together or separately, data on firearms availability for the nation as a whole and for discrete geographic and demographic subpopulations discredit the syllabus that the possession of guns is the primary cause of murder. The actual cause is hopelessness, poverty, and lack of substantial employment opportunities other than competing in the murderous drug trade. Studies suggest that black rates of homicide and other violence are no greater than those of similarly situated whites. In that connection, consider the following remarks. This is a quote. Fixating on guns seems to be for many people a fetish which allows them to ignore the more intransient causes of American violence, including its dying cities, inequality, deteriorating family structure, and all the pervasive economic and social consequences of a history of slavery and racism. Moreover, an overemphasis on gun control diverts attention away from the kinds of conditions that are responsible for much of our crime, such as persisting poverty for the black underclass and some whites and Hispanics, the impact of post-industrial transition on economic opportunity for working class youth, and the shortage of prison facilities that makes it difficult to keep high-risk repeat offenders off the streets. The next section, a critique on overt mendicancy. In 1989 article in the Journal of American Medical Association approvingly quoted a Center for Disease Control official assertion that work for the CDC involved systematically building a case that owning firearms causes death. The CDC official, later named the Journal for American Medical Association, the JAMA, had misquoted him and offered the only repudiation of the anti-gun political agenda we have found in health advocacy publication, characterizing it as a anathema to any unbiased scientific inquiry because it assumes that the conclusion at the outset and then attempts to find evidence to support it. Unfortunately, that is precisely what CDC is doing. Instead, this was subsequently avowed by the prior official's successor. Even more unfortunately, CDC and some other health advocate sages built their case not only by suppressing facts, but by overt fraud, fabricating statistics, and falsifying references to support them. The following are but a few of the many examples documented in a paper by the two authors of this article cited. One of those frauds is an exception to our generalization a few pages ago that the health advocacy literature never compares gun ownership and murder rates through the 1970s and 80s. Some health sages claimed murder rates increased overall during that period and then linked this falsehood to the same period's steady increase in gun ownership so as to lead spurious support to their more guns equals more murder syllabus. Thus, a 1989 report to the United States Congress by the CDC stated, since the early 1970s, the year-to-year fluctuations in firearms availability has paralleled the numerous homicides. We have to leave it to the readers of this article to judge how a 69% increase in handgun ownership over a 15-year period from 74 to 88 could honestly be described as having paralleled a 14% decrease in homicide during that same period. Understandably, the CDC report offered no supporting reference for its claim of parallelism, but the inventive Dr. Diane Schletke and two equally inventive CDC writers, George Smith and Henry Falk, in a separate article actually do provide purportedly supporting citations for her claim that handguns account for only 20% of the nation's firearm, yet account for 90% of all firearms misuse, both criminal and accidental. The problem is that the claim is false, so every part of their citations are fabrications. The purpose of Schletke's claim is to exaggerate the comparative risk of handguns vis-a-vis long guns so as to fortify the cause of handgun prohibition and avoid admitting the major problem we have is already addressed, that because handguns are innately far safer than long guns, if a handgun had been caused defensive gun owners to keep loaded handguns instead. If a handgun ban caused defensive gun owners to keep long guns instead, as handgun ban advocates and experts concur would be the case, thousands might die in fatal gun accidents annually. The only citation given by either Schletke or Smith and Falk to support their claim that handguns are but 20% of all guns, yet involved in 90% of gun accidents and crime, is the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports. Understandably, no page citations are given because the citations are falsified. As anyone familiar with the Uniform Crime Reports knows, they provide no data on gun ownership and thus no comparative data on handgun versus long gun ownership, no data on accidents, and thus no data on gun accidents, and thus no comparative data on the incidence of handguns versus long gun accidents. Schletsky and Smith and Falk have continued firearms breakdowns on fatal gun accidents in the National Safety Council's Accidents Facts volumes. But these data would not have suited the purpose since they do not support the point Schletsky, Smith, and Falk set forth. Neither do the UCRs give any data on the number of persons injured in gun crimes or the number of such injuries in handgun crimes versus long gun crimes. The UCRs do give such data for gun murders, but even those data do not support Schletsky's claim that 90% are by handgun. Every one of the other purported statistics given by Schletsky and Smith and Falk in their above-mentioned articles is not only wrong, but wrong in one particular direction. Each false statistic supports their point, whereas an accurate rendition of the statistic would not have done so. It is, of course, elementary that inconsistent mistakes tend to be random and that to balance each other rather than erring all in favor of the position for which they are presented. Next to be considered is the remarkable Dr. Sloan. Giving him the benefit of the doubt, we put down other mischaracterizations by him to the gun adverse dyslexia. We put down other mischaracterizations by him to gun adverse dyslexia. But it strains even that generous category unduly to so classify an inability to accurately read and describe in his own articles. The gravamen of the Sloan two-city comparison discussed earlier was that the new highly restrictive Canadian anti-gun law caused Vancouver to have less homicide than Seattle, where any reasonable adult can buy a handgun. But an NRA representative noted in a critical letter to the New England Journal of Medicine that the authors had made no effort to determine how Canadian homicide had changed since adopting the law. In fact, the homicide rate had not fallen, as Sloan claims would have required, but rather risen slightly. With handgun use unchanged at about 1/8 of homicides, Sloan tried to extricate themselves from this embarrassment by asserting that the intent of our article was not to evaluate the effect of the 1978 Canadian law. The mendacity of that is made clear by juxtaposing it to the article's actual conclusion. Canadian-style gun control is associated with lower rates of homicide. Not surprisingly, that it is exactly how other health advocates understood the article's intent, as demonstrating the beneficial effect of Canada's higher regulation by evaluating firearm mortality in Seattle and Vancouver, similar communities with vastly different regulatory strategies. It would be misleading to suggest that heavily politicized though it is, the anti-gun health literature commonly exhibits overt falsehoods, has opposed to misleading by half-truths and suppression of false material facts. Overt mendacity is not infrequent, however. Numerous examples will be documented in the next section and in the balance of this chapter.